at the poles that are going to change our whole world. If you look at the North Pole, we have Greenland on the right. In the centre is a very large sheet of ice. It's called sea ice. It floats on the sea. It's 2 or 3 metres thick. It is, or I should say was, the area of Australia. 8 million square kilometres of ice. That ice is now disappearing very, very quickly. In 2005, the purple line demonstrates where it used to be in summer. That was 2005. In 2007, 12 months ago, the ice melted to half its usual area. In addition, it's becoming much, much thinner. They now think on average it's 1/3 of the thinness that it was, from 3 metres to about 1. So taking those two figures together, this summer, 2 months ago, there was only 20% of that sea ice there that we had before global warming really started to take effect, which has led one of the NASA scientists to come to a terrible but honest conclusion that we must also come to, and that is that we are killing the Arctic ecosystem. The head of the WWF Arctic program, Neil Hamilton, told a seminar at the Academy of Science in May that the world was creating a new Arctic climate system. He said we, meaning the WWF, are no longer trying to preserve the Arctic ecosystem because it is no longer possible to do so. Those were his words, and they've never let me. And he continues to say, we are not clear what the Arctic ecosystem will look like in 50 years' time, because none of our models are working. What we do know is that when that ice melts one summer and stays unmelted until the sunlight fades and it reforms in winter, that the regional temperatures in the Arctic will go up by about 5 degrees. And this is important because to the right of that sea ice in the photo was Greenland. And Greenland has enough ice on it that if it melted, it would increase the sea levels around the world by 7 metres. So the question that really needs to be answered is, when will Greenland go? And I do not know a single climate scientist who says if that large amount of sea ice, which by volume is 80% gone, Greenland can stay. It's if the motor for the fridge has gone. And so Kim Lenton, who joined with 70 other climate scientists in a conference last December, and they looked at tipping points, and most of them thought that Greenland was on its way to going. So what we have done already is going to drive the sea levels up by 7 metres, unless we stop it and cool the Earth. That means 1 to 2 metres this century. Will Stephan from Climate Science at the ANU told a conference in Darwin up to 4 metres. Couldn't be ruled out. Now this matters very greatly because there is a strict relationship between temperature and sea level. The cooler it is in ice ages, more the ice stacks up on the continents. As it warms, the ice melts and the seas rise. So you can see on the left, at the last ice age 20,000 years ago, the seas are about 120 to 140 metres lower than they are now. And that 5 degree temperature rise we had melted enough ice to push the seas up to the current level, the geological period called the Holocene. And as you can see, for that last 10,000 years, it's been flat. Like that blue line we looked at previously, it's been flat. And of course, if temperatures are going to kick off that blue line to the right, then so are sea levels. So in the worst cases, which are obviously river deltas and coastal lands, in the case of Bangladesh, the mid-red colour is about a 5 metre sea level rise. So if Greenland goes, and we have certainly tipped the domino over so that it will, perhaps a third or a half of Bangladesh will be underwater. And even for lower amounts of sea level rise, remember the experts are saying 1 to 2 metres now. This is from New Scientist recently. We see in Australasia, 1 metre sea level rise will affect 1.7 million Australians and an area of 150,000 square kilometres. So what we have already done is going to have great, great impacts. Climate science has many aspects to it. I just want to talk about a couple very quickly. In the Northern Hemisphere, in the frozen north, the area is coloured brown. There's a large amount of what is called permafrost, permanently frozen ground. And because the Arctic sea ice is melting and Greenland will melt, the Arctic will increase in temperature between 5 and 10 degrees this century. And at about 9 degrees, the permafrost starts to melt really seriously. We see the first aspects of it now, where lakes are forming on this frozen ground. The ground is starting to get soggy, so houses are starting to slip, roads are starting to slip. At the moment, it's relatively insignificant. But if we keep on going, if the sea ice remains missing, if Greenland melts, if these temperatures rise, then we will release large amounts of carbon from the permafrost. Because it comes unfrozen, bacteria gets in, it starts to warm, and it will keep on driving itself. And there is more carbon in the permafrost than in the atmosphere. So if it goes, most species and most people on this planet will not survive. There are lots of these tipping points. I don't have time to talk about them all. We know, for example, that ENSO, the El Nino effects have a devastating effect on Australia in terms of precipitation and temperature. They also affect the Asian monsoons, and they reflect across to Africa and around the world. These are not isolated incidents. The dominoes are lined up. We have pressed and pushed the first couple, and they're about to topple. And these will run around and around the globe, north and south. Perhaps, I think, the morally most difficult of these to deal with, and I still find it flabbergasting, is that in the Himalayas, it's predicted that glaciers will melt by the mid-century. These are two photos released by Greenpeace 40 years apart. And you can see the difference. And people say, well, glaciers go, we don't go skiing in Australia anymore. In Asia, it's very different. 1 billion people live on the river valleys that flow off the Himalayas. 1 billion people. In the dry season, it is the melting of those glaciers and those ice sheets, the Himalayas, the Hindu Kush, the Tibetan Plateau, that provide the water flows for those people. If the ice isn't there in winter, it can't melt in spring, and those river flows will be severely depleted. In the case of the Indus, which runs through Pakistan, 60% of the population of Pakistan live on or depend on the Indus. And without those ice sheets, they think that water flows in the Indus will decrease by 90%. And these are events and consequences so flabbergasting that I really don't know how to think about it, or to understand that those who make decisions in this world can think that these are of no consequence, because we are dooming peoples and nations and river valleys and villages to destruction, and species, of course, as well. And of those species, the most obvious, and you've seen some media coverage about this recently, is the question of ocean acidification. As there's more carbon dioxide in the air, more is taken down into the ocean. So the oceans are now 30% more acidic than they were before we started. And we are now getting close to the point where the seas will be of sufficient acidity for organisms that have to take down and set hard shells, calcium shells, will no longer be able to do so. Remember, we were at 387, that figure I talked about earlier on, 387 parts per million. This comes from a climate scientist in Brisbane. He says that probably around about 450 parts per million, coral will simply cease to form. And obviously hard-shelled animals will no longer be able to set their shells as well. Having recognised all those impacts, the question of